Good morning, Tribal Jazzman Scholar. I'm going to relate a story about humor and the power of humor and laughter to ease the most tense social situations. I remember reading a book about a guy who had hitchhiked around the United States. He was from Denmark, and he had a very long beard that was in a braid. And I only read the first few pages of his book, but he said that he'd been in some of the most dangerous parts of our country and some of the worst urban areas. And he said whenever he got into trouble, he always pulled out his beard and made some joke about how he looked. He said it always got him out of trouble. But the story that I want to tell is my own experience. I made a trip to South America when I was 25 years old, and I had made a commitment to going into the jungle. So I flew to Pucallpa, which is a city in the jungle, the smallest city that still had an airport, and I flew from Lima by myself, and I made up my mind that I was going to go into the jungle and that I was going to try to go in as deep as I could. So I took a bus out to a lake near Pucallpa where I'd heard guides would often come and offer their services if people were looking for a trip into the jungle. And so I got a little room in a hostel, one of two hotels on this lake. It's a very small sort of rural area at the end of a 20-mile dirt road out of Pucallpa. And every day I began to go out and interview these guides, and I was really trying to suss out how well they knew the more remote areas that were upriver. There was a preserve that Peru was keeping and not allowing any mining or any other activities like logging in this area, and it was thousands of square miles. And I knew that there were a lot of native peoples living there, so I would ask these guides every day to draw me a map of that area of the jungle, and none of them could produce a map. So I spent several days waiting and wondering, and in the hotel I was staying at, the owner of the hotel and I got talking one afternoon over a warm Coke, and he had a stack of letters on his desk, and I said, "What are those?" And he goes, "Oh, those belong to the anthropologist." And I said, "Oh, who?" And he said, "Bruno, the anthropologist. He comes every 3 or 4 months to get his mail." I said, where is he?" And he said, "He's at Lake Caimito. It's about 4 days away by boat, upriver." And I made up my mind in that moment that that's where I was going to go. I was going to go to a Shipibo Indian village where there was an anthropologist, a Westerner, who might offer me the chance to get into that village. And so I continued to interview guides and very specifically asked them to draw maps of that region. And I finally found someone who'd actually been there twice and ended up getting a ride with him upriver for 4 days to this village. And the man that was my guide, his name was Mauro, and both of his parents had been members of an indigenous tribe outside of Iquitos, Peru, that had been assimilated. And Mauro, in spite of his look and his manner and his deep connection to the earth and his intensity, he did not consider himself Indian. On the contrary, he was mestizo, which means mixed, which also means non-Indian. And he insisted that he was not Indian. When I finally got to the village, many stories in between, Mauro didn't get out of the boat, even though all along the river, the 2 or 3 nights to get there, he would jump out of the boat and make, easy banter with people and trade maybe some kerosene for a place to stay. And he had a way of relating to people that was very gregarious and friendly, and always found us places to stay along the way in these mestizo homes that were scattered along the Upper Ucayali. But when we got to the Shipibo village, he wouldn't get out of the canoe. And I figured, well, maybe he figures we've reached our destination, I'll get out. So I got out, and after some interesting exchanges, I met the anthropologist, and he realized I'd been a student of anthropology, invited me into the village, and there began several days of a wonderful experience. He looked over at my guide, Mauro, and he said, "Mauro won't get out of the boat." And I said, "No, I don't know why." And he goes, "He won't because he won't relate to the Indians. He refuses to interact with Indians. They're beneath him." And then I suddenly realized that he was probably right, because Mauro was so friendly and gregarious every other time, but never with Indians. They were always with the mestizos that we encountered. So eventually Mauro kind of came to the edge of the village, and he began to hang out a little bit, but he stayed in the boat most of the time. And then he asked me one afternoon if I wanted to go hunting. And I had been a vegetarian for a long time, but I was convinced that I was going to eat monkey meat because that was the delicacy of the jungle. So a group of howler monkeys were making quite a fuss, and Mauro grabbed his shotgun and invited me to come with him. And so off we wandered into the jungle. And as you reach the outer edges of the Shipibo village, you begin to encounter the individual huts that belong to the Shipibo elders. And there'll be maybe 200 meters of pure jungle, and then you'll come to a little clearing with a little hut, and there are these open huts with no walls and maybe a little garden. And as we were following these howler monkeys, it began to rain. And it started as a drizzle at first, and Mauro said, we must get shelter. He turned around and led me back to the last Shipibo elder house that we'd passed that was empty. Nobody was there. It had things inside. And Mauro reached down into the garden and grabbed this pineapple, beautiful pineapple that was growing in a very small garden patch, and snapped it off, and then climbed up into the Shipibo hut. And I followed him, and we sat down, and the rain began. We were making small talk, and then the rain let up, and out of the jungle comes this Shipibo man carrying a shotgun himself. And he had some small animal that he'd shot, and he came walking up to the hut, looking at us saying, what are you doing in my home? And I suddenly realized, oh my gosh, I didn't know if it was a storage shed. I didn't really know. I was following Mauro. I was trusting Mauro to know, where to get shelter from the rain. But he went into a Shipibo person's home, and Mauro immediately stood up, and they started talking to each other very fast in Spanish. And then the Shipibo man looked down and saw the pineapple next to Mauro and said, and you've not only invaded my home, but you've taken my food. You've taken my pineapple. And Mauro's getting very defensive. And within a minute, they're face to face in the Shipibo hut, both holding these double-barreled shotguns, maybe 6 inches from each other, yelling in each other's face. And I just on a whim, was a joke teller all through college, and I had a whole big collection of jokes that I would tell. And I had only once tried to tell them in Spanish. In fact, it was the night before at our last mestizo home. I did a hour-long joke telling in Spanish that was very successful. So I suddenly realized, I guess my jokes translate. I'm good enough at Spanish. So I'm watching this argument, and I just stop both the men, and I put my hands on their shoulders. I say, I have something to say. And I launch into a joke. And I'm animated, and I'm getting their attention, and they're looking at me. And I'm going on, and I'm trying to be as lively as I can be. And I get to the punchline, and they're both laughing hysterically. And then I start to tell another joke, and Mauro sits down on this log, and the man's listening, and then he sits down. And then 15 minutes later, I've told 3 or 4 jokes. We're all laughing. We're eating pineapple. We're having the best time. I took a deep breath and thought, that could have gone a different way. But it didn't, thanks to humor. So let's keep humor alive in our lives. Tribal Jazzman scholar with stories from the deep Amazon signing off. Thanks.